Okay, it's time to begin. Appreciate you being here this morning. We are resuming our study in 1 Peter. I got you an outline this morning if you want to get one in the back, if you don't have it already. I know it's, you might have overlooked it, but I decided to do an outline today because of the topic I wanted to do is more thematic. And so I wanted to sort of illustrate Peter's approach to glorifying God in difficult times, which is, I think the main thrust of his, reason he's writing. But if you think about the occasion or the situation that's present as to why he is writing to the Christians that have been scattered, it has to do with what we identified as the fiery ordeal that they're presently experiencing. That's how it's communicated. When he says, don't be surprised with the things that are happening around you as though something strange is happening. So that is sort of, I take that as the reason, or the primary reason, that Peter has gotten information from these Christians, and they're kind of in a dilemma as to why they're facing these kinds of hostilities with their neighbors. And so he pens this epistle to them and couches all of his message thematically and illustrating how they can glorify God in the midst of the difficulties. So, we have discussed how he reframes the suffering. He reminds them, you remember, that Christianity started with Jesus being rejected and all that. So it would make sense that Christians would face rejection as well. So it shouldn't be anything strange, but for the Gentiles, it was somewhat unusual. I think this is what he means when he says, live as free men. He's referring to the Gentiles. They're, live as free people, but don't use your freedom as a cloak for, immorality. That would resonate with, I think, the Gentiles, because, Jews never really thought they were free. They always had the attitude or the compulsion about them to overthrow, or one day, the Messiah to come and they're liberated out of Roman rule. But the Gentiles, they were Romans, free people. So in looking at this, I do think the audience for that Peter's addressing is including both Jew and Gentile, but I think it's primarily Gentile people. But Peter is using a lot of Jewish allusions or symbols, and he does that, I think, to demonstrate to the Gentiles that they've been brought into the kingdom of God. You were once not a people, okay? Well, that would really resonate with the Jews, because they had been God's chosen people, right? So in writing to the Gentiles, they have never been considered, God's people, for God selecting, the Jews to, operate through. But now they've become the people of God. They've become a holy nation. They've become this. So it's pertinent. The overriding message is to the experience primarily of the Gentiles. Now, because of this fiery ordeal, look at chapter 4. Let's see. Let's start in verse 12 of 1 Peter chapter 4. So this is what I think is the reason why the letter was penned by Peter to them. He says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Now, he's already introduced this idea of being tested, and that's the way that he's framing the persecution or the rejection by these Christians' neighbors and other people that don't appreciate what they've done, decide now that they're on, they're trying to follow God, and so they're being harassed in many ways. And so he describes it as a test. Now, what's a test for? What does a test do? Why the language of testing? He says, don't look at this, be surprised, because it's a test. What?
Testing is to find out what you know, if you understand what's being taught.
Yeah, a test is somewhat like an assessment, isn't it? I mean, in school we have, I give tests, exams, and quizzes, and it serves as an assessment of, for one thing, for me to know where they are, but also primarily to show them where they are. So in the test, and it's interesting that the word test and tempt are like, it's a two-sided coin. God doesn't solicit, but he allows testing. He looks at it as testing, not the solicitation to sin. Satan will use the occasion to get people to sin. God desires for you to use the occasion to assess the mettle of your faith for endurance, you see. This is one aspect, I think, of suffering and things that the non-Christian doesn't understand. And sometimes Christians don't understand, because when we face challenges or temptations and things of that nature, people have this somewhat, I think, misguided view that we ought not to be facing these things. Why is God doing this? Well, it's I think a way that God is using the occasion to help us grow and to learn endurance and to show you that there's a way of escape. What is the way of escape? James talks about each one, when he is tempted, he's tempted by his own lust and drawn away. And the lust is conceived, it brings forth sin. When sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. That's the process of following through with temptation. All right? But in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we have the statement, no one has been tempted above that which they are able. But with the temptation, there's a what? There's a way of escape. What's the way of escape?
Jesus.
Yeah, it's to choose the will of God. So what's God's word? What's his guidance in this matter? Well, if you take it from Joseph's situation, what did he do in the Old Testament? He fled. He ran. I like the passage that said that he fled, not that he walked away. He fled, and that's a way of escape. See, it's not. I think God show me the door or the way. Well, he has already shown it. He shows it to us all the time. What we need is let me have the courage to follow your guidance and to trust you and remove myself from the situation. Give me the strength to flee, to change course. That's always been the way of escape.
Scott, that we think we're not going to suffer because, Jesus told his apostles, they're persecuting me, they're going to persecute you.
Yeah.
And he suffered. Why do we think just because when we become Christians?
I don't know. It is a good question. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Why do we think, or generally, you see it all the time because we're always kind of surprised when something bad happens to us.
It makes us stronger in our faith. If we have enough faith, we can learn from it.
Yeah.
Benefit from it because we know that God loves us and he will take us out of all the trials and tribulations that we're going through.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biblical mindset of it. But for some reason, that is one of the arguments against Christianity. If God is so good and so loving, then why does he allow evil? You know why he allows it? To test.
You think that's what the last part of that verse is kind of referring to there? It says, don't think of these things as being strange, you know?
Yeah.
Don't think of it as being something like, I shouldn't have to endure this or whatnot, right?
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
When people have been saved, they expect everything to just, all their problems to just disappear, all the bad to disappear. When things don't happen that way, they become discouraged. They say, well, I did what I was supposed to do, and it's still worse, and nothing's changing. So, then they'll go back into their old ways.
And they're looking at it wrong. What's wrong with that view? See, nothing outside is changing, but the point is they're not changing. You see what I'm saying? God is changing your heart and your mind. It doesn't mean you necessarily don't change the circumstances. Could, providentially things happen, but God's more interested, it seems to me, for us to mature in faith. And so he reframes it, he rewrites it, and says, you need to look at this as a way in which you grow in faith. And sometimes that exercise of faith makes you sore, makes you hurt. I got this student that comes in my class, in my preaching class. It's funny. He's a very smart Bible major, and he walks in like this. And I know what he's done. You know what he's done? He's lifted weights. He's done squats. Like, heavy weights. He's done like this. He comes in, his legs are just like sore, And I said, oh, you squatted today? He said, yeah. So he's real sore. So why is he doing that? I mean, he's a Christian. He shouldn't have those pains. We should be able to lift weights, and I get sore. I ought to be able to leap buildings and stop trains and things like that, right? You can't progress without enduring the pain. It just doesn't make sense, the critical thoughts of atheists and the accusations against Christianity, as if all trouble, all problems, once you become a Christian, fall away.
I don't understand why people think that. Look at Paul. He never had an easy road.
No, yeah, he's a perfect example. On every turn, there was a Jew on his tail. Yeah.
I think people think that because it says when you become a Christian, you become alienated. You become different than the world. So they feel as though when they become Christian, things are going to be different because you can't be a Christian and be part of the world. So the world goes through this suffering, but we shouldn't. But what they don't understand is we are still set apart because of the way we handle the things that come upon us. Not that it's not going to come, because he tells us clearly that it's going to come. It's how we deal with it.
Right.
What sets us apart.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the message that, of the Bible itself, and particularly 1 Peter. So it's not a valid argument or a way of thinking of why am I having, why God? That's just, I think it's natural. Why are these things happening to me? But Peter is forcing them to follow the example of Jesus. That's who he upholds in chapter 2. Consider the example of Jesus, right? So it shouldn't be surprising. But we're human, right? It's always surprising sometimes what things transpire when we're trying to do good. Why is my goodness or my choice of doing what's right and godly things, why is that contributing to pain, anguish, and hurt? I've become a better person. It seems like the world would embrace that. I'm going to be a better citizen, a better person. Well, the world likes darkness more than it likes light. I mean, it will always be a good and evil battle, warfare, yes.
I always go back to Job. You know, Job, after everything he went through, that God just allowed it to happen. But Satan was testing him to find his strength, his weaknesses. Everything was, he passed the first one, he passed the second one, he passed the, and then so on and so on. So in the end, Job was a better person than he was to begin with, because he'd been put through the fire. He was hardened then and more stable at the end than he was even at the beginning, because he kept the faith and he passed every test that Satan put at him. And, you know, I think about Jesus when Satan came to him after he had fasted and, you know, said, you know, food.
Yeah.
And so he was trying to find that weakness.
Yeah, and I think that was, I would look at it as Satan is the one that's trying to tempt us to rebel and tempt us to curse God.
And
You
it
know,
continues.
and it will always continue.
You know, in here, when we're with each other, we draw strength from each other. But out there is where most of the temptations and things like that take place.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have Bible studies and meetings on Sunday night, Wednesday, whenever, is we're strengthened together.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have,
Go ahead.
is there a difference between then, because, you know, like in James, as you mentioned, I think it was James 1 where it says, you know, God is not
Tempted with
testing
evil.
you
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
pride. But then is there a difference between testing, well, testing won't be evil, but is there a difference between testing and temptation?
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same word. It's the same coin with two different sides on it. Satan's motive is to get you to buckle and rebel against God, to sin, temptation.
Yeah.
God allows Satan to work, but his motive
Is to grow.
is to grow and test you and strengthen you.
Yeah.
So God does not solicit anyone to sin,
No.
okay? Because God's not of that character. Well, then someone would say, well, why does he allow evil to operate? Okay, well, there's several reasons that we could answer that. Number one is we wouldn't know good without evil. You know, there's the free will that we have, and that's where the little point is, and the rub is, how do we use our free will? How do we exercise it? Do we yield and follow Satan, or do we endure and trust in God, the way of escape? So every challenge that we face, okay, has the potential of those two things. We either cave, all right, give in to the pressure, to the pain, or whatever, or we go the door of escape. And what is that? Trust God.
So what's it? Draw near to God.
And he'll draw near to you. Yeah. So, it's not anything that should be strange, because the whole essence of Christianity began with the rejection of Jesus Christ. You know, as far as, you know, Jesus dying and being nailed on a cross. Now, just as a review quickly, preliminary considerations of the term Christian. This you're well aware of. The word Christian is only used 3 times in the New Testament. And the first time was in Acts 11, verse 26, when the church in Antioch is meeting together. And this was the first time that the disciples, the believers, were called Christians. Okay? Well, I always have wondered, why then? Okay? What was different about the church in Antioch that wasn't characteristic of the church in Jerusalem. What does Antioch represent? The church.
The difference between two of them would be the church of Jerusalem would be, I would think, primarily Jewish.
Primary Jewish.
Antioch would be primarily Gentile.
Yeah. In fact, it's the first recorded in the New Testament of Jew and Gentile congregation, where, you know, Paul and Barnabas and all them and that church is sending, you know, it's fulfilling what Acts chapter 1 says, that they will be witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the world. And Antioch becomes that home base, so to speak, that Paul and Barnabas are sent to the rest of the world. So they're first called Christians here, and it seems to me more than just a statement that somehow the word Christian began to be applied to them. I think it's providentially or theologically appropriate, because here we see Jew and Gentile working together. And that's the whole point of the gospel, right? And then from that, reaching the rest of the world. So it's the idea of inclusion, and that makes sense, because who is Peter writing to? Well, he's writing primarily dealing with the Gentile, but Jews are included too. It's a message to both, but dominantly to the Gentiles who are facing things they never faced before. The second time the word Christian is used is before Agrippa, when Paul's giving his defense of his apostleship and who he is to authorities as to what he's been doing, and, you know, the accusations that are been brought against him. And you remember the statement, "You almost persuade me to be a Christian." And Paul says, not only you, but everybody who hears my voice would be that without these chains, of course. And so what, in the context of that, what's happening? Well, I think Paul is giving his defense. He's giving a reasoned explanation of what the gospel is. And Agrippa, you know, you wonder, is he serious, or is this just a statement that's made? But I find it curious that Paul is defending the faith in a reasoned way before these authorities. And the word Christian is used in that context. And so I think it has to do with defense of the gospel, you know, reasoned belief. Now, a lot of people don't take the reasoned defense of the gospel or Christianity. It's more subjective. It's more that I feel the Lord. I feel this. How do I know? Well, see, that's not even characteristic of the way the gospel was presented. But that's how modern, I think, Christianity leans into more of subjectivism away from reasonableness. I mean, something that's objective. Christianity is an objective, reasoned message to the world. It doesn't mean that it doesn't touch us emotionally. It does. But, you know, I can be touched emotionally by all kinds of things. You know, it doesn't verify that just because I simply feel something that it's true. That's where the emotions can get wrong. Just because I'm brought to tears concerning something doesn't necessarily make it so that my Christianity is verified, or I'm a child of God. What I obey and what I come to is what the gospel tells me, as these people did. They, in obedience to the truth, you see, they became God's children. So Christianity is often couched in making a defense for our faith. That was true in regard to the people that Peter was writing, because you remember in 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15, he says, "Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts," doing what? Ready to make a defense of the hope that is within you, okay, with gentleness, of course. And then the third time it's used is in Peter, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 16. If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. So those three instances in the context tells me a lot about Christianity. It has to do with inclusion of Jew and Gentile, all people. It has to do with a reasoned message that impacts all people. And it has to do with the attitude in regard to how one deals with what they're facing in life. Perseverance and trials. Now that's, you know, if you want a good sort of summary of Christianity, I think these three contexts with the word Christian, it kind of summarizes what Christianity is all about. Now, so what I want to do here is, if that is true, then how do we glorify God in the midst of the trials? Okay. Well, this is where Peter has a lot to say about this. So look at chapter 1 and verse 14. I summarize it as you got to fight against the temptation to give up. That's exactly what Satan wants you to do. We, however, as God's people, we fight against that temptation to give up by giving into the external pressures that are upon us. Whether the pressure is from the authorities, or our neighbors, our friends, our family. All of this goes back to what Jesus taught, remember? He said, whoever loves mother and father more than me is not what? Worthy of me. Well, what does he mean by that? What's the point of making that statement? It's a shocking statement. You know, if you don't, and some, I think it might be, I'm not sure which gospel, Luke, I think, even used, unless you hate your mother and father, you know. And he's not saying that we should hate mom and dad. I mean, that'd be a violation of, you know, honor your mother and father. I mean, it's the basics of the law, right? So why does he use the word hate? He uses it to get attention. I mean, it's an extreme commitment to God that rises above everything. Mom and dad, our family, or even our children. God is priority. That's the point. He's priority. And so we have it stated in other ways, seek first the kingdom. The one that we are serving is God. He doesn't mean by this, because Jesus in other places talks about us taking, you know, he rebukes the Pharisees for not taking care of their parents in old age, because they use the excuse that they dedicated what they could to God, so now they're not under any obligation to care for their parents. And Jesus rips them apart in the Gospel of Matthew, so that's not right. You got to show love, but he emphasizes the fact that God is priority. So we have to fight against the temptation to give up by giving into external pressures. So in verse 14, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Verse 17 through 18. And if you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourself with fear throughout the time of your exile. Now this is sort of this is a reminder, okay, to them. We are to conduct ourselves with fear while we remain exiles. So what does fear mean? Fear is one of those words also that's like a coin with two sides.
Well, yeah, I mean, a son will fear his father's punishment, but not out of a lack of love, but I think because of a sense of reverence.
Yeah, a respect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some say, you know, we live in dread of God, or we live in respect and reverence for Him. Well, it depends on what path you're choosing. You know what I'm saying? Because in the book of Hebrews, it talks about falling into the hands of the living God, you know, reminding that one would need to fear and dread judgment if one is or has rejected God, you know, because in that choice, they are not showing reverence and respect, right? But then on the other side, those who are walking God's way and choose God, they live in fear as well. But their obedience is, as Tim said, it's out of respect and honor for who God is. So there's that, you know, it's a two-sided coin, and it really sort of determines the meaning of it on which path you're on, you know. So we fight against temptation, and we remember the reason we do not submit to temptation, or we try to endure and fight it and go through the way of escape, is because of our Heavenly Father. It's because of God. We respect and honor God. We glorify God in our bodies, in our minds, and our actions. We want to bring honor to God. And, you know, it's naturally to understand that because we've been children, we've had parents. Some kids, you know, rebel and whatever, and they get punished. There's a certain fear of punishment. And some, out of love and respect and honor of who the parent is, you know, obey and comply. So it's not any different really when you think of it spiritually. Same kind of application. Look at chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. He says, "For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you, but they will give an account to Him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." That phrase, living and the dead, is interesting because earlier he talks about preaching the gospel to the dead, which I think is referring to those who are not in Christ. You know, it's like what Paul would say in the book of Ephesians, that, you know, we were dead in our trespasses and sins, and we were quickened, made alive in Christ. So that sort of illustrates the environment in which these people live. And this was normal culture that existed at the time. Now, we look at this, and I'm somewhat not surprised because the same kinds of things, you know, happen today. You know, spring break's coming up pretty soon, and you'll have all these college kids, a lot of them will go to the beaches and various places, and they'll drink, they'll have sex, they'll, you know, be involved in all kinds of debauchery, won't they? I mean, it's no. And think of Think of it if you had friends that are all going, and say, Tim, you going? You going? No, I'm not going. What? You're not going? You know, and you become the brunt of the joke, or, you know, they don't understand. You were our friend, or don't you? You know, the same kind of things happen, and it's, you know, it seems like it's getting worse and worse as you know, culture becomes more catering to idolatry and various things. So this is what they're facing. It's kind of like having lots of friends and all of a sudden you don't have anyone. You know, sometimes that happens in Christianity, doesn't it? But that's where the family of God comes in place. It becomes more important for the church to be strong as a family in order to invigorate, strengthen, and help one another. All right, so we got to fight against the temptation to give up by giving in to external pressure. So we don't want to be pressured by external things to sin against God and allow Satan to defeat us. So that's one of the purposes, I think, that Peter is hammering. The other thing is there's a positive side that seems to be prevalent in 1 Peter, and that is we can silence critics by accepting nothing less than a highest standard of behavior. You can silence the enemies, which I find kind of interesting. So what are the things that represent the highest standard of behavior? Well, Peter lists several of these. Number one is to submit to civil authorities. Chapter 2, beginning in verse 13, he says, be subject for the Lord's sake. See how God's always brought in to the discussion as to how Christians ought to act, right? Be subject for the Lord's sake. Pay your taxes for the Lord's sake. Be the model citizen for who? For the president? For the governor? For whatever? No, for who? For the Lord's sake. That's who we serve. And so, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution. Well, what if they're corrupt? What if they're corrupt? What if things we don't agree with? What does he say? Submit yourself to the institutions. Rome was very corrupt. The leaders were, the governors, and depending on what emperor was ruling, you know, it could be a good thing or it could be a terrible thing. He says, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this, that word for is the reason or the conclusion of what he's previously said. For this is the will of God. What is it? That by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. I'd like to see more of that happen, wouldn't you? But that's the hope, that's the desire. That's the way that God instructs us. You never know. Paul was able to influence a lot of people who were in positions of authority, who changed their opinion about him because of his behavior. Even Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. Okay? Although he signed off on him being crucified, his wife, and he went out there and said, you know, I don't want anything to do with this guy. It's kind of interesting that Pilate had that reaction. He was somewhat fearful of who Jesus was. He knew that the Jews were lying. He knew the accusations were lies. Well, you might say, well, he's still crucified. Yeah, But Pilate was impacted. We don't know sort of the life of Pilate too much, after that. But we never know the influence that we have in an official, a leader, someone of prominence becoming a child of God. Paul mentioned that there were several in the emperor's house who had become Christians. Okay. So it may be several years before culture changes or something changes, but the seed was sown by Paul and his behavior way early. So we're actually generating great potential and possibilities by us holding ourselves to a higher standard, God's standard, the standard of holiness. So submit to civil authorities. I hate to go into the driver's license place and sit and, sometimes having to do this. When I was at Montgomery, you'd go in there and sit, get a number, and it is so, and I would see people get upset, argue, all kinds of things that would happen. And it was somewhat amusing sometimes to see how infuriating people got and impatient. And I had to always keep reminding myself, you are a Christian. You are a Christian. Don't say it. So that's the commitment that we have to have. And he says there's the potential that we end up silencing. What does it mean, silencing? How does he say it? Doing good, and you silence the ignorance of foolish people. What does he mean by that? What is silencing the ignorance of foolish people?
I have no charge.
I have no charge against you. And people know it, The other thing is, in chapter 2 and verse 16, is to live responsibly, which I brought up just a minute ago. He says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living, here it is, he always brings what I call the theology into the passage. God's always brought into it as the standard or the reason why we do things, as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So live responsibly. So we have a lot of freedom here in our nation, but it's not used as a cloak for evil, to disguise evil, to exploit others, to take advantage. We don't participate in that kind of thing. So if we own a business or we work in a business, we have employees, all this stuff, we show ourselves to be responsible. We do our work, we do it the best that we can. Why? Because we're working for whom? The Lord. It changes everything. What if my boss is a terrible person? Well, you can quit and look for another job, but while you're there, you do what? You work for the Lord. Number 3 is we need to learn to defer to one another. That's a hard thing in our society, because it's not, it seems like in our culture, people are asking you to defer to their opinions and their wants and their needs. Respect me. Listen to my word. All this. The character of a Christian comes out in the examples that he uses. In chapter 2, verse 18, it's quite striking. He says, servants, be subject to your masters with all what? Respect. Okay? Not only to the good ones and the gentle ones, but also to the unjust. This goes against every natural inclinations in one's body if you're in that situation. But for the Christian, there's consistency of behavior, right? You continue to defer. You work, you do what you're told. The amazing thing about all this and the way that Paul addresses the slavery issue with Philemon is from the inside working out. In that Christianity would naturally call for the end of slavery because of the behavior of those that are involved in it. You have the master who is converted to Christ. You have the slave who is converted to Christ. Paul says, treat him as a brother or sister. So, you know, it's an interesting dynamic. Okay, our time's up. We'll finish this up next time.